Dive Podcast, straight talk on politics, national security, and America's future. With Robert Johnson and Linda Miller, we cut through the spin, tackle the tough issues, and give you the real story behind today's headlines. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to stay informed.
Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we unearth crucial insights from complex information. Today, we're embarking on a deep dive into the intricate tapestry of recent geopolitical developments. We're going to explore international strategies, high-stakes diplomatic encounters, and, well, the constantly shifting landscape of global power dynamics that shape our world.
That's right. And our focus areas for you today include Ukraine's intensifying strategic efforts to build influence across Africa, which is quite interesting. Then there are the significant and maybe at times contrasting conversations between U.S. President Trump and Ukrainian President Zelensky. And then we'll pull back a bit for a broader perspective on how conflicts in one region can ripple outwards, influencing others. Our mission here is really to equip you with the core understanding and potential implications of these events, helping you connect the dots. Okay, so let's unpack this.
Absolutely. Let's start our journey in Africa. It's a continent that has become an increasingly vital arena for geopolitical influence, especially, it seems, for Ukraine lately. We know Ukraine has been directing significant diplomatic and aid efforts there. What's the driving force?
Indeed. Ukraine's primary objective in Africa is, well, it's multifaceted. They clearly want to significantly elevate their international reputation, foster new alliances, and critically pursue potential trade agreements with African nations. But beyond that, there's a strong rhetorical push. They are actively working to persuade these countries that their current struggle for sovereignty, well, that it has direct parallels with Africa's own historical efforts to overcome the legacy of European colonialism. They're specifically drawing a direct comparison, sort of framing Russia as a Soviet-era master attempting to reassert control. It's a narrative designed to resonate, tapping into, deeply rooted historical sentiments across the continent.
That's fascinating how they're trying to weave this historical narrative into a practical, sort of actionable strategy on the ground. So what specific actions are they taking? How are they trying to achieve these, quite ambitious goals?
Their strategy involves several calculated key actions. A primary focus, and maybe the most impactful right now, is on food supplies. And this isn't just about humanitarian aid, though that's part of it. It's seen as a strategic imperative to prevent Russian President Putin from using food shipments as a political lever, especially in a continent often vulnerable to food insecurity. We've seen concrete examples like food aid delivered to Malian refugees escaping violence, and also to the Democratic Republic of Congo. And beyond just immediate aid, there are active discussions, we understand, with the Democratic Republic of Congo on long-term agricultural and food security agreements. They're aiming for more sustainable partnerships.
Okay, so food aid acting as both a humanitarian gesture and a diplomatic tool. Smart. What else is part of this strategic outreach?
Well, beyond food, there's a significant expansion of Ukraine's diplomatic footprint. Since 2022, they've opened 8 new embassies on the continent. That brings their total number of missions to 18. It really reflects a long-term commitment to direct engagement. And looking at the security side, there's been an offer to train military personnel in Mauritania. That signals an interest in deeper security cooperation, which is, another area where external powers often compete for influence.
Right. This push by Ukraine obviously has implications for Russia's established presence and role in the region. How is Russian President Putin's government responding to this increased Ukrainian engagement? Are they pushing back?
Oh, Russia is certainly not sitting idly by. Not at all. They have their own robust engagement strategies across Africa, often leveraging historical ties and, of course, military cooperation. They've expressed readiness to enhance the combat capability of countries like Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, places often facing significant internal security challenges. This includes offering to train soldiers and law enforcement. But what's crucial to understand is that Russia also pushes a counter-narrative. They often state that Ukraine is, in their view, supporting terrorists in the region, working alongside who they label as former colonizers. So this raises a really important question for us to consider. How do these two diametrically opposed narratives and competing strategies actually play out on the ground, in terms of winning hearts and minds? And what are the long-term implications for the already complex security and political stability in Africa? The continent isn't a monolith, after all, and different nations will respond differently.
That's a critical point. So while Ukraine is focusing on building influence in Africa, High-level diplomatic discussions are continuing elsewhere, often with very different stated priorities. Let's move to that pivotal meeting involving the U.S. President Trump and Ukrainian President Zelensky. This encounter recently generated some genuinely interesting points and, notably, a discrepancy in their accounts.
Yeah, that meeting. It took place during the NATO summit in The Hague, lasted about 50 minutes, roughly. Ukrainian President Zelensky publicly characterized it as a prolonged and substantive meeting. He emphasized that it covered all really important questions from his perspective. His portrayal definitely painted a picture of comprehensive and detailed discussions.
Right, but here's where the narrative gets particularly intriguing, though, and where we see that significant divergence you mentioned. There was a notable discrepancy about the main topic.
Precisely. Ukrainian President Zelensky stated quite clearly that the overriding topic of their conversation was a ceasefire in the ongoing conflict, which would naturally be paramount for Ukraine. However, the U.S. President Trump contradicted this account directly. He later remarked quite simply that he just wanted to know how Ukrainian President Zelensky was doing. Flared up. This difference in stated priorities is pretty stark, actually, and it raises a lot of questions. What does it reveal about their respective strategic communication, maybe? Or even their underlying objectives for that meeting? Was one side perhaps downplaying a key agenda item, or were their interpretations just that far apart? This kind of disconnect, well, it can sow confusion and potentially complicate things down the line.
Regardless of those differing accounts of the immediate agenda for that specific meeting, the U.S. President Trump did express a broader sort of overarching goal concerning the conflict's future. What was that?
Right. The U.S. President Trump articulated his belief that Ukrainian President Zelensky genuinely wants to end the conflict. He also said he views the present as a great time to end it. Furthermore, he indicated his own intention to speak again with Russian President Putin to explore possibilities for ending the conflict. So that signals a desire from the U.S. President Trump side to actively engage in peace talks, potentially. However, and this is important, we have to note Russian President Putin's consistent stance. He has stated that Moscow aims for settlement, yes, but that the main task for 2025 remains the continuation of the military operations objectives. This clearly highlights a significant gap, doesn't it? A gap in expectations and approaches to a potential resolution. One side seemingly looking to end it, the other prioritizing military goals for now.
A crucial aspect of this conflict, like any modern conflict really, is military aid. Shifting our focus there for a moment, what specific weaponry does Ukraine consistently say it needs most urgently?
The U.S. President Trump specifically mentioned that Ukraine most urgently desires Patriot anti-aircraft missile systems. These systems are incredibly sophisticated, designed for missile defense capable of intercepting a range of airborne threats, from ballistic missiles to cruise missiles, even aircraft. He did note, however, that while the U.S. would explore the possibility of additional supplies, these systems are, quote, very difficult to get. That implies their high demand globally and, the U.S.'s own strategic needs. It points to a real bottleneck in military assistance.
You mentioned their sophistication. How effective are these Patriot systems actually proving to be on the ground? Have there been any significant challenges with them?
Well, the U.S. President Trump publicly described the Patriot complexes as 100% effective, even mentioning their supply to Israel as an example of their capability. However, the reality on the battlefield, as you might expect, can be far more complex. An official from the Ukrainian Air Force Command has actually reported a decrease in the Patriot's effectiveness against certain Russian ballistic missiles, specifically against Iskander missiles. The challenge with Iskanders is that they perform complex maneuvers in the final stage of flight. That severely complicates trajectory calculations for intercepting systems like the Patriot.
So much harder to hit a target that's actively dodging at the last second.
Exactly. It significantly increases the difficulty of a successful interception. And furthermore, there have been reports indicating that Patriot systems in Ukraine are being depleted, partly due to persistent drone attacks, forcing them to expend valuable interceptor missiles. This also leads to another critical concern. Ukraine is reportedly running low on those very interceptor missiles. That highlights a pretty significant sustainability challenge for this high-value defense asset. It's a crucial detail for understanding the air war dynamics.
Okay, this issue of military aid and its effectiveness, it naturally leads us to think about the broader geopolitical landscape. If we connect this to the bigger picture, how might other global situations, specifically thinking about the de-escalation efforts in the Middle East, how might that influence the Ukraine conflict? Is there a potential ripple effect?
That's a really important question, about global interconnectedness. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, who has unique experience participating in negotiations with both Moscow and Tehran, suggests that the de-escalation of conflict in the Middle East, specifically between Iran and Israel, could indeed have a positive influence on the situation in Ukraine. His perspective seems rooted in the idea that if a major geopolitical hotspot stabilizes, it can free up diplomatic and strategic bandwidth, maybe even resources, that could then be directed elsewhere. The hope is, I suppose, that the momentum of peace in one area might become, well, contagious.
Contagious peace, an interesting thought. So what does this optimistic outlook from Witkoff actually mean for a potential resolution in Ukraine? How might the spread of peace, as he hopes, manifest itself?
Well, Witkoff expressed clear optimism. He voiced hope that the current positive developments in the Middle East might, quote, spread to Russia and Ukraine. He envisions a scenario where parties involved in the Ukraine conflict observe the successful de-escalation with Iran and essentially say, we also want to be part of the peace process. He believes this could lead to very, very good events in the settlement between Russia and Ukraine. It's a vision of diplomatic contagion, maybe, where success in one area inspires efforts in another. And it's worth noting as context that Russian President Putin and the U.S. President Trump did discuss both the Middle East and Ukraine during a call on the U.S. President Trump's birthday. The Russian side later confirmed readiness for continued negotiations. So that suggests that the channels for discussion, at least at the highest levels, seem to remain open, which is, of course, a prerequisite for any kind of positive ripple effect to occur.
We've just navigated some incredibly complex currents of international relations today, from Ukraine's strategic pushes for influence in Africa to the nuances and, frankly, contradictions and high-level diplomatic exchanges between the U.S. President Trump and Ukrainian President Zelensky, and then looking at the significant ripple effects that global conflicts can have on one another.
Yeah, what's really clear is the profound interconnectedness of all these events. Developments in one region can, and often do, significantly impact another, creating a landscape that's just dynamic and constantly evolving. And this leads us to a fascinating question for you to maybe consider as you reflect on these insights. How might smaller, seemingly isolated diplomatic or aid efforts like Ukraine's engagement in Africa contribute to broader, perhaps unexpected shifts in global power and alliances? And how might those shifts, in turn, influence the trajectory of ongoing conflicts far beyond their immediate borders? Something to think about.
Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.